Introduction to Talking Books. On behalf of the Division for the Blind and Physically Handicapped of the Library of Congress, I want to welcome you into the Talking Book program. If this is your first experience with a talking book record, I feel confident that you will find relaxation, entertainment, and information in books and magazines covering most subjects of general interest. For those of you who are already acquainted with talking books, I hope by adding to your knowledge of the program to enable you to gain greater satisfaction from this record player, the records you will receive from now on, and the regional library that will be serving you personally. Perhaps I should start with the voices that will be reading the books and magazines to you. Let me introduce a few and tell you a bit about them. First, myself. I was one of the school magazine editors and a co-editor of the yearbook. I went to West Virginia University intending to study journalism, but I'd already begun to act in high school, and in my one semester at West Virginia, I was active with the Dramatic Society there. I left the university on the death of my father, and returning to New York, I was accepted as an apprentice at Eva Le Gallien's Civic Repertory Theater. It was there that I had my first taste of the professional theater, walking on in the theater's productions and studying in the apprentice classes. My first Broadway part was the player King in Leslie Howard's production of Hamlet in 1936. Since then, I've worked in the theater, in radio, television, and films. But of late years, I've been active for the most part in the field of radio and television narration, and chiefly as announcer in numerous commercials. It has been, however, in the recording of talking books for the blind and physically handicapped that I've found my greatest satisfaction. I've been recording talking books almost from the start of the program, my first one in 1937. In the intervening 30 years, I've recorded about 300 books. I think I can safely say that almost every other actor reading the talking books feels, if not quite to the same degree, to some extent, pretty much the way I feel. Although some of us don't have to do it to make a living, not one of us, I've noticed, unless it's for reasons of health, ever drops out. I hate work. I've always hated work, but there's one big work that I would never give up. I know that as long as I can speak and as long as I'm acceptable to the foundation and to the people who get the books, I'll go on recording as long as I can stand on my feet or get to the studio. I'm going to read two selections. The first from Robert Crichton's novel, The Secret of Santa Vittoria, and the second from Winston Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Fabio woke in the early afternoon. He was still tired, but he woke because he was hungry. He looked around the small house, but there was nothing in it to eat, not a piece of stale bread or hard cheese. He was sorry he'd eaten all the cold beans. He left a note for Ernesto. Ants would starve to death in your house if ants would come into it. And he went out into the Corso Mussolini and started up it toward the Piazza of the People to try to buy some bread and cheese and wine. The midday sun blinded him, and he was forced to hold on to the walls of the houses until his eyes could adjust to the glare. When he reached the piazza, he was conscious of groups of people standing about in it, looking back down toward Old Town, but he was too blinded to see what it was they were looking at. The Piazza of the People is the center of Santa Vittoria. It is a flat plateau of cobblestones that divides the city into two parts. Above the piazza is High Town, where the houses sit on a saddle of land in the sun. No one knows why the city wasn't built there in the first place. The people who live in High Town are called goats. The people who live around the piazza are called turtles because of the fountain. Below the piazza is Low Town, or Old Town, where the frogs live, because in the spring, after a rain, little green frogs hop in the dank, moss-green streets until the rats and the cats and the children get to them. On a tourist map, although tourists don't come here, Old Town is listed as the medieval section, which makes it sound better. Frogs almost never marry turtles, and turtles don't speak to goats. That's the way they are here. The city is steep. The Corso Mussolini, which runs through Old Town up to the Piazza of the People, is so steep in places that the street becomes flights of stone stairs. The Corso runs down to the Fat Gate, which is the main passage through the Fat Wall, which the Romans began and which someone else finished, and which runs all of the way around Santa Vittoria. There is another way out, the Thin Gate, but this is used mainly by small boys and goats, since the track that leads down the mountain from it is so steep. In the summer of the Roman year 699, now described as the year 55 before the birth of Christ, the proconsul of Gaul, Gaius Julius Caesar, turned his gaze upon Britain. In the midst of his wars in Germany and in Gaul, he became conscious of this heavy island which stirred his ambitions and already obstructed his designs. To Caesar, the island presented itself as an integral part of his task of subjugating the northern barbarians to the rule and system of Rome. The land not covered by forest or marsh was verdant and fertile. The climate, though far from genial, was equable and healthy. The natives, though uncouth, had a certain value as slaves for rougher work on the land, in mines, and even about the house. The Romans, however, hated and feared the sea. By a supreme effort of survival, they had 200 years before surpassed Carthage upon its own element in the Mediterranean. But the idea of Roman legions landing in the remote, unknown, fabulous island of the vast ocean of the north would create a novel thrill and topic in all ranks of Roman society. Thus, in this summer, 55 years before the birth of Christ, Caesar withdrew his army from Germany, broke down his massive and ingenious timber bridge across the Rhine above Koblenz, and throughout July marched westward by long strides towards the Gallic shore, somewhere about the modern Calais and Boulogne. In the early days, Britain was part of the continent. A wide plain joined England and Holland, in which the Thames and the Rhine met together and poured their waters northward. In some slight movement of the Earth's surface, this plain sank a few hundred feet and admitted the ocean to the North Sea and the Baltic. Another tremor, important for our story, sundered the cliffs of Dover from those of Cape Grisnez, and the scour of the ocean and its tides made the Straits of Dover and the English Channel. As an actor, Kermit Murdoch, our next reader, has been called upon to play roles as different from one another as the president of Yale and a comic cab driver, or as Clarence Darrow and John Dillinger. In real life, Mr. Murdoch would seem to fit most comfortably into the robes of learned counsel or a college president, an impression that is confirmed by his involvement in public affairs. He's been active in New York politics since 1938 and was at one time vice chairman of the Queens County Liberal Party and leader of his assembly district in Queens. Mr. Murdoch was born in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh, but grew up in Brooklyn. It was during his senior year at Harvard that he decided on an acting career and applied to do graduate work at Yale with Professor George Pierce Baker. His appearances in the Yale dramatic productions marked the start of his career. Since then, he's worked steadily in radio, television, the theater, and films. Mr. Murdoch is another who's been with the Talking Book program for many years, and his resistance to being typecast, say rather his versatility, has stood him in good stead in recording the hundreds of books he has been assigned. Mr. Murdoch reads first from the 19th century English mystery story, The Moonstone, by Wilkie Collins, and then from The Firmament of Time, by Lauren Isley.
I address these lines, written in India, to my relatives in England. My object is to explain the motive which has induced me to refuse the right hand of friendship to my cousin John Herncastle. The reserve which I have hitherto maintained in this matter has been misinterpreted by members of my narrative, and I declare on my word of honor that what I am now about to write is strictly and literally the truth. The private difference between my cousin and me took its rise in a great public event in which we were both concerned, the storming of Seringapatam under General Baird on the 4th of May, 1799. In order that the circumstances may be clearly understood, I must revert for a moment to the period before the assault, and to the stories current in our camp of the treasure in jewels and gold stored up in the palace of Seringapatam. One of the wildest of these stories related to a yellow diamond, a famous gem in the native annals of India. The earliest known traditions describe the stone as having been set in the forehead of the four-handed Indian god who typifies the moon. Partly from its peculiar color, partly from a superstition which represented it as partaking of the nature of the deity whom it adorned, and growing and lessening in luster with the waxing and waning of the moon, it first gained the name by which it continues to be known in India to this day, the name of the Moonstone.
Man is at heart a romantic. He believes in thunder, the destruction of worlds, the voice out of the whirlwind. Perhaps the fact that he himself is now in possession of powers wrenched from the atom's heart has enhanced the appeal of violence in natural events. The human generations are short-lived. We have difficulty in visualizing the age-long processes involved in the upheaval of mountain systems, the advance of continental glaciations, or the creation of life. In fact, scarcely 200 years have passed since a few